Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author and broadcaster. Take 6 girls, all of them rampant individuals, and let them loose upon one of the most politically explosive periods in history, and what you have is the story of the Mitford Sisters. I have to say that I held the Mitford Sisters in a low regard before I started my research on this podcast, and I hold them in an even lower regard now. And look, I know there is a Mitford Trust and you can go and visit their graves, and people will, but honestly, I can't find a good word to say about any of them. And I can actually usually find the good in everyone. But look, I am happy to hear my listeners' arguments if you have them, and if you feel like sending them through to me, I will address them on your behalf. I'm really going to try and not do them a misjustice because I have done my research, but see what you think and let me know. So with that being said, let's take a quote. Let's start with a quote from evil international man of mystery and all-round villain Rudolf Hess, talking about Unity Mitford. I met her in the Osteria Bavaring. She was very romantic. The Osteria was a small inn. It's still there, and it hasn't changed much. Small tables. There is a wooden partition, and behind it a table that could sit 8. An adjutant would phone the owner to warn him that Hitler might be coming and that they should keep the table clear. There was also a courtyard with a table under a pergola, and this was Hitler's favourite seat. When the weather was not cold, Unity Mitford was quite often seen there. I was only invited every second or third time. Like me, Unity would be invited by the adjutant Stab. She was highly in love with Hitler. I could see it easily. Her face brightened, her eyes gleaming, staring at Hitler, hero worship. Absolutely phenomenal to witness, and possibly Hitler liked to be admired by a young woman. She was quite attractive, and even if nothing happened, he was excited by the possibility of a love affair with her. Towards an attractive woman, he behaved like a 17-year-old would. Unquote. Just in case you don't know who Rudolf Hess was, he was a German politician and a leading member of the Nazi Party in Nazi Germany, appointed Deputy Führer to Adolf Hitler in 1933. So this is the story of the Mitford Sisters, to be sure, but also of Britain's most notorious Nazi, Unity Mitford. She is the only British person who has the most access to Hitler leading up to the start of the Second World War, and possibly of any foreigner. She meets with Hitler over 140 times, a staggering amount. And I would go further and say that although Oswald Mosley and indeed Unity Mitford's sister Diana, who marries Mosley, are probably more significant figures within the history of British fascism, I would say that Unity Mitford is possibly the best known British fascist among the general public, simply because there is such a fascination with the Mitford sisters. Unity is a self-avowed Nazi, and the fact that she can be integrated into Britain's heritage industry, one that I absolutely love, is actually really, really interesting to me. So the first biography that was written on Unity Mitford, one of the 6 famous Mitford sisters, was by David Price Jones in 1977, and he subtitled it The Frivolity of Evil, which is a play on the banality of evil, and I think an absolutely brilliant title, which is why I used it as a subtitle for this podcast. And I think that there is a sense perhaps in which part of the appeal of fascism, and by the extension Nazism in 1930s Britain, there is an element of frivolity among the upper classes. I think there is a paranoia among much of the upper classes. So there are definitely people that, I don't know, in the 1920s, let's say the Duke of Northumberland, who's very rich and very entitled, like the people that he mixes with, who actually feel genuinely, almost hysterically afraid of Bolshevism. And, you know, they kind of sell out by the mainstream political parties and so on. But in the case of the Mitfords, there is a slight sense of something incredibly sinister, sort of role-playing that kind of goes out of control. The fascinating thing for me about the United Kingdom, and I mentioned this earlier on, is the heritage industry. I love visiting the UK, and I'll go there just for that. And a favorite part of the country for me is North Oxfordshire. It's a beautiful county, which is very close to the Mitford family estate. And there are walking tours and there are Mitford walking tours. And I know people, otherwise sane, well-adjusted people who are obsessed with the Mitfords, who absolutely love the Mitford Sisters, who love going to their graveyard and seeing the Mitford graves. And they have lots of books on the Mitfords. It's quite an astounding phenomenon. Now, for a lot of our listeners overseas, this will be absolute babble. You won't know who the Mitfords are. And I actually had this conversation with someone this morning when they asked about what podcast or what was the next podcast I was about to produce. And I said, the Mitford Sisters. And he said, who? So let me explain just who this extraordinary family are and where and why they have this hold over the British imagination. So the Mitfords are actually a very ancient family. They had lands in England even before the Norman conquest of 1066, which was given to them by Edward the Confessor up in Northumberland, which is the north of England. But there's a kind of junior family from Hampshire, and these are the ones that end up with lands in the Cotswolds, an absolutely beautiful part of the country. And the thing about the Mitfords is there are aspects of their heritage that seem to precondition them for a particular interest in Nazism. So I'll go through Unity Mitford's grandparents just to give you a little bit more color. Her grandfather on her father's side, so that's the Mitford side, he was a very distinguished diplomat. He served in Japan and actually then all over the world. He was an incredible linguist and he became a very good friend of Richard Wagner. He saw all the Wagnerian operas, including the Valkyrie. So these are all operas that Hitler was absolutely obsessed with. And Hitler will come to know this. And these operas tell a story of statuesque goddesses with blonde hair who gallop around on horses, picking up the fallen dead and taking them to Valhalla. He then meets Hewitt Stewart Chamberlain, who is British, but he becomes, actually in 1916, so during the First World War, he becomes a naturalized German subject. And he is also vehemently anti-Semitic, and the Mitford sisters' grandfather translates his book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, into English because he'd written it in German. So, there's a little bit of German history there. Her parental grandmother was the sister of Clementine Churchill's mother, so the woman who actually marries Winston Churchill. And that's an additional part of the mix. And the Mitford sisters, in fact, often go to Chartwell to see Cousin Winston. And Churchill actually wasn't particularly interested in most of the Mitford sisters, although he admired Diana a lot, who was by some way the most beautiful out of all of them. And Randolph Churchill, his son, had a massive, massive crush on Diana, as pretty much did everyone else in London society at the time. So their grandfather on their mother's side, he was also an absolutely massive anti-Semite. And he goes on a journey through the Holy Land, goes to Jerusalem, and he says of the Jews, if they had been expelled from Jerusalem, then they're the rulers of London, Paris, and Berlin. Quite the statement. And his daughter, so the mother of the Mitford sisters, Sydney, seems to have inherited this instinctive anti-Semitism, although she was a great admirer of the Mosaic dietary laws because she firmly believed that Jews never got cancer. And she attributed this to their not eating pork or shellfish. I mean, that's a very unusual medical opinion, even if I do say so. So the Mitford sisters' father, David, hates foreigners, damn foreigners, and all that kind of thing. So he becomes Lord Redesdale when his brother dies in the First World War. So he's the younger son, but inherits the title because his brother dies. And he's also a spectacularly hopeless investor. Effectively, every investment that he makes goes wrong. And at one point, he decides to go gold prospecting in Canada. Not a bad idea at the time. So he buys a gold mine at a place called Swastika. I mean, you couldn't make that up, could you? And he goes there with Sydney, his wife, and it's there that Sydney conceives, or well, together, they conceive their fourth daughter and fifth child, who, when she is born, is given the name not just of Unity, but of Valkyrie, after the Valkyries, actually on the recommendation of her parental grandfathers. So she is named Unity Valkyrie Mitford. And so all of this is giving her a certain pedigree and a certain heritage, wouldn't you think? So she's one of 7 children. For those not in the know, here's your crib sheet. There were 6 Mitford sisters, as I mentioned, born between 1904 and 1920. They lived through some of the most extraordinary moments of the 20th century history. They knew everyone from Hitler through to JFK, and each of them carved out a distinct and undeniable identity. In age order, there was Nancy, a famed wit and celebrated novelist; quiet, homely Pamela, who wanted to marry a horse as a child and eventually became a poultry rearer; then renowned beauty and fascist Diana, who married first Brian Guinness of the famed Guinness family, and then later Oswald Mosley, and went to prison for a bit. Hitler fangirl Unity, who we've just mentioned slightly, who shot herself in the head when the Second World War started. Communist rebel Jessica, who eloped with her cousin and later became a campaigning journalist in America. And down-to-earth, well, relatively speaking, Deborah, who became a duchess and hobnobbed with royals and actually rejuvenated Chatsworth House. They had a son, an only son, who was formally schooled effectively owing to finances as much as male entitlement. The Mitfords were, let's just say they were socially privileged, but not economically flush. The girls' education was more spotty, kind of a haphazard affair, with their mother and an array of governesses, teaching lessons in reading, arithmetic, and French, leaving big blanks in the curriculum. And of course, left to their own madcap devices, the girls formed a tribal bond, speaking their own language and minting a chattering thicket of nicknames for their parents, which ended up with, well, I suppose Dad was called Fave, and Mum was Muv. All of them will actually have interesting careers, which is why I think they're still objects of such popular fascination. But I think for our purposes, by miles, the most interesting one is Unity, because she goes even further than Diana, who is an ardent fascist, by saying publicly that she actually wants to meet Hitler. And keep in mind, this is the late 1920s, early 1930s. And because Unity, Jessica, and Deborah are born, well, I guess several years after Diana, they are kind of grouped together as the young girls. And so they all live slightly in Diana's shadow. And Diana is incredibly beautiful, incredibly glamorous. And so Unity, I think, in particular, feels that she has to show off if she's going to make her mark. And so that's what she does. And her character is enhanced by the fact that compared to the other girls, she's very big boned. She was described as galumping, which nowadays I suppose would be statuesque, and that's probably a more polite way to describe her. She also has these kind of incredibly large, baleful eyes, and she develops this technique of sitting at the dining table as a child, slowly shuffling mashed potato into her mouth and gazing at her father. And her father would become more and more furious by this, and he would bellow at her, stop staring at me. And she would continue to stare at him, but then he would absolutely explode, and she would slide under the table and stay there and refuse to come out. She obviously took pleasure in rousing her father to a condition of absolute fury. And I think there's a sense in which all of the girls, she's actually perhaps the most difficult to handle. So the Riesdales, like a lot of the aristocratic families at this time, did not approve of sending their daughters to school. They saw it as vulgar. And Nancy Mitford, who became a writer much later, said of her father that he thought one got thick calves from playing hockey, and he didn't want that for any of his daughters. The parents actually find Unity so stressful to actually have around that they actually do send her to school. And on the 2 occasions that they did so, she ends up being expelled. And the final time when she's expelled, she's 17. And Lord Reesdale himself actually goes to the school to try and persuade the headmistress to take her back, but to no avail. The headmistress absolutely refuses. And there's actually no records of saying why, so we don't know why that is. I guess we can just ascertain that she was probably just a very difficult child. Meanwhile, as Unity is kind of, going to school and being expelled, coming out of school wondering what to do, Diana is absolutely out there. She is a British society beauty. She's a bright young thing. And she's married Brian Guinness, who is fabulously rich. Interestingly, at the same time, Evelyn Waugh actually dedicates his latest book, Vile Bodies, to her and Brian. And for Unity, you can see that this makes her even more glamorous than she'd been when they were children. She's more kind of like a moth drawn to a flame. And Unity immediately starts hanging out with Diana and Brian. And also probably thinking, this is the person who I want to impress. So 1932, she comes out. Which doesn't mean that it doesn't have the same connotation that it has today. It means that she joins this kind of circle of gals who are upper class, who are being presented at court, who are circulating around the various dances and parties, and so on in Chelsea with the aim of meeting handsome young men. But Unity, she cuts this tremendous dash, says the Daily Express in the summer of 1932, and comments of her that she is the prettiest girl in the land. And that's a bit like the red carpets of today. People are actually interested in debutantes or debs, and Unity is, I think, a very intimidating figure to men. She's very, as I said before, statuesque. She also has a fondness for stunts that seem to get her noticed. She apparently has a rat called Ratula, which she keeps in her handbag, and at dances she will take it out and stroke it just for the shock effect. And she also has a snake called Enid. And the story goes that on occasion she'll actually wear it instead of a necklace. Now, I'm not entirely convinced whether that story is true, and these stories actually come from her younger sister Jessica, who was prone to exaggeration. And the simple reason why I'm hesitant about that particular story, applying all my historical acumen, is that rats and snakes don't get on well together. It's very kind of Ron Weasley, isn't it, out of Harry Potter. Look, the story may be true. I'll leave that up to you. At this point, Unity still has absolutely no interest in politics, let alone in fascism. But 1932 is the year in which Diana Guinness, as she is by this point, starts her on-off affair with Oswald Mosley. And Unity is kind of coming along in the train. So they actually, they all go to a ball hosted by Lady Rothschild, who is obviously a very significant Jewish society figure. Neither Diana nor Unity have any problem with this at all. But by October 32, Mosley is actually starting to go full fascist. So he's putting on the black shirt. He's holding all his rallies. And meanwhile, Unity she's absolutely oblivious to this. She's become an art student. She seems to be very good at art. And I can actually imagine her becoming a kind of bohemian figure, a posh bohemian figure. I do love a posh bohemian figure, as you know. And at this stage, Mosley's wife, Simi, who was actually the daughter of Lord Curzon, even as Mosley is having an affair with Diana, Simi falls very dangerously ill, and she actually has a burst appendix. So Mosley goes to hospital with her, he accompanies her there, and he spends the morning with her, and then he goes out to lunch with Diana. This is the first time he meets Unity. Unity is actually with Diana, and she is immediately besotted with Mosley. She absolutely idolizes him and starts calling him the leader. And let's be fair, Mosley is a very enigmatic, very good-looking aristocrat of the time. And he could well have been prime minister had he actually stayed with the Labour Party and not made this break. So Unity then joins the fascists and becomes And actually, she's actually out there walking the streets. She becomes a full-on fascist selling black shirts on the streets of Oxford. And she takes it very seriously. Although, I have to say, seriousness with the Mitfords is always relative. There's a brilliant account by Anthony Rumbold, who is the son of Horace Rumbold, who was the ambassador to Germany in the build-up to the Nazis taking power. And he goes down to Swinbrook, which is the Mitford estate, which is beautiful, by the way. And Unity is there with Jessica, who's the communist. And the two girls, they set on the poor guy. And they basically ask him, is he a fascist or is he a communist? And he says, well, I'm actually neither. I believe in democracy. And they look at each other, and the answer they give as they walk away is, how wet, which is very, very Mitford. So Unity has thrown herself wholeheartedly into fascism in exactly the way that her younger sister Jessica has become an absolutely committed Stalinist. And they're both very into their respective dictatorial figures. But I think there is a sense in which for Unity that the trudging around the streets, selling fascist shirts and magazines, it's already becoming a bit boring. And she's already thinking, I want to go beyond what Diana has at this point. And Diana at this point has actually bagged Mosley. They haven't actually got married, but they're clearly together in society. And Unity's thinking, how can I go one better than Diana? And of course, Diana has her fascist leader, but there's an even more significant fascist leader that Unity decides to go after. So just before we get into that, I had a serious question. I mean, these are such unserious people that it seems weird to ask a serious question, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I was thinking about the other aristocrats who were drawn to fascism because of fear in the 1920s and 1930s, because of that kind of paranoia and whatnot. With Unity Mitford, we haven't mentioned her at any point reading a book, for example. And that led me to thinking, is this a frivolity that has completely got out of hand, a frivolity of evil? Or is there any seriousness, genuine ideological commitment to this cause at all? And the answer that I came to is, I think at this stage, it's absolute frivolity, and there's a desire to shock. And I think with Diana, who's actually very bright, very well-read, very smart, I think it's thought through. I think that she commits herself to Oswald Mosley, not just because he's incredibly good-looking and charismatic, but also because she completely comes to believe in his cause and what he's saying. So she's a thinker. Unity isn't a thinker, and it seems to be much more instinctive. So Nancy Mitford, the eldest of the Mitford girls, who will become a very famous novelist, she actually gives a portrait of Unity as a fascist and compares her to the suffragettes. And she actually hints to and says that in an earlier age, Unity's yearning for a cause, the sense that she wants to be part of something bigger than herself, might well have led to her campaigning for the suffragettes and votes for women. And I think that maybe, a few decades later, she also might have become a kind of Marianne Faithfull equivalent, a posh groupie. So I think that she's actually just looking for a charismatic man. And I think she's looking for excitement. She wants to shock. I think all these kind of elements that you can see very much in the way that people behave in the 1960s, I think they're already there in the 1930s, which may well be why people through the 60s and actually to the present day identify with the Mitfords. There's something quite 60s about their whole attitude in the 1930s. But obviously with Unity, she takes it to a very dark place, and she goes in a very dark, different direction. And she gets her opportunity to meet Hitler for the first time in August 1933, when she travels to Nuremberg as part of a delegation of British fascists. That party actually includes William Joyce, who goes on to be Lord Horwell. And at Nuremberg, Unity actually sees Hitler for the first time, and she writes to her father of him, "The first moment I saw him, I knew there was no one I would rather meet." Love at first sight. So she goes back to England, and this is when Nancy spoofs her, because she's actually going around mooning over Hitler in the way that she might have done in the 60s over, I don't know, say Mick Jagger. So she's actually giving And I find this absolutely mind-blowing. Unity's actually walking around giving the Hitler salute to everyone that she meets. And, she'll actually go down to the post office and click her heels and say, Heil Hitler. And everybody finds it incredibly odd. And Jessica, who's the younger sister, the communist, who you think would be, vehemently opposed to this on one level she is. But it's still a bit of a game. It's like they've kind of chosen their rival pop stars. Unity's chasing Mick Jagger or Adolf Hitler, and Jessica's chosen Paul McCartney or Joseph Stalin. And this obsession leads to her the following year, so in the spring of 1934, actually going to Munich, where she knows Hitler is. And this is actually his main base. And she actually enrolls in a language school right next door to Nazi headquarters. And she's actually joined there by Diana all of that summer and all of the autumn. And she spends it hanging out in the Osteria Bavaria, as described by Rudolf Hess at the beginning of this podcast. She then goes to all the Nuremberg rallies. Again, it's a bit like going to Glastonbury, or something. And she gets caught up in the excitement of the crowds and the rallies and of Hitler's magnetism. At this stage, she's actually wearing her black shirt. She's wearing it like a uniform. She acquires a gun. She's wearing that too. And she actually becomes an object of absolute fascination with all the SS senior officers. There's this very Valkyrie-like fascist blonde British aristocrat in her fascist uniform who they absolutely love. And she becomes friends with them, and she is actually advised by them not to wear too much makeup because Hitler doesn't like makeup. So she watches that very carefully. After 10 months of continuously going to the Osteria Bavaria, finally someone comes over and says, the Fuhrer would like to meet you. And she goes over to hang out with Hitler, and she writes to her father, to Lord Redesdale, "It was the most wonderful and beautiful day of my life." What on earth is going on in her head when she's meeting Hitler, when she's hanging around with these people who are already at this stage, for the avoidance of doubt, who are already steeped in violence and bloodshed and have actually made no secret. I mean, frankly, anyone who's read Mein Kampf or Hitler's speeches of the 1920s will know they have made absolutely no secret of their genocidal ambitions. So what on earth is she thinking? And she does actually have a copy of Mein Kampf, which is signed by Hitler and also signed by pretty much every other lunatic in the Third Reich. And she keeps it like a kind of autograph book and shows it to, everyone that she comes into contact with. And the question of what's she thinking? So Nancy Mitford, who actually remained devoted to her, even though Nancy was very much on the left, she wrote a letter about Unity, that with the whole Nazi thing, Unity took it as a joke. This was just great fun. It was all a bit of frivolity. And she writes that, Unity used to drive around Europe, Central Europe, I suppose, in a uniform, in the Nazi uniform with a gun. And then she says, Unity was absolutely unpolitical, and no one knew less about politics than she did. And I think that is actually the classic posh dilettante kind of get out, isn't it? This was great fun. We knew nothing about politics. We didn't know what we were getting into. It was all such good fun. And I think with Unity, there's an element of that. I think there is an element of, it's just a tremendous laugh. And if people are shocked, then so much the better. And I think there is undoubtedly a sense of kind of erotic fascination, particularly with the SS and the stormtroopers, and whom she even calls my darling storms. I mean, unbelievable. And she comes back after one trip to Munich, and the family nanny actually corners her, whose name is Blur. Weirdly enough, she is German. And she says, "I do wish you wouldn't keep going to Germany, darling. All those men." The nanny certainly identified something that was going on. And I think Unity could have been in some kind of erotic daze, or it's just all a tremendous laugh, or she's doing it just to shock. But you know what? That actually doesn't excuse her, because she goes full in on the darkest aspects of Nazism. She knows that if she's going to keep Hitler's attention, she has to keep herself kind of absolutely within his gaze. And with this, she very much nails her colors to the Nazi mast. I'm sorry, but she does. She does this by taking up with a man who, even by the standards of the Nazis, is a complete monster, a Julius Streicher, who edits a magazine called Der Stürmer, the Stormtrooper, a man who actually has a shaven head, a moustache. He looks and acts like a thug. And, you know, to actually put it in context of the Nuremberg trials, the other Nazis on trial, they avoid him like the plague because they regard him not only as vulgar, but as a monster. And also, quite a lot of people at this time in Britain from her aristocratic circles say, but he's so common. And I think there's an element in the Mitfords are so posh that this actually doesn't bother them. And I can only imagine guys like George Orwell, who were around at this time, for instance, tying himself up in knots about this, you know, feeling incredibly embarrassed. But for the Mitfords, there is a sense in which the fact that so many of the Nazis are very non-you, and just to explain that, Nancy Mitford's terminology, you and non-you, is if you're a you, that is acceptable to, say, 7% of the population, and a non-you is the other 93%. So Unity feels absolutely no requirement to kind of compromise with her own upper-class morals or behavior because she knows that actually people like Streicher will love that. So there's a sense of, I guess, a kind of sense of commonality between the upper classes and the lower classes that, again, someone like Orwell would never be able to buy into. He would be far too embarrassed about it. So Unity goes in big with Streicher, who is in charge of the press. He's quite a significant figure, actually, for the likes of Mosley. And so when Mosley gives a speech in Leicester, Streicher actually sends him a telegram saying, "Congratulations, I very much approve of the speech you gave." And Mosley actually sends him a telegram back saying, "The power of Jewish corruption must be destroyed in all countries before peace and justice can be successfully achieved in Europe." Mosley's going in big on anti-Semitism as well. You know, Mosley's biographers, interestingly, don't mention this telegram, but he definitely sent it. You know, Nancy and Diana were aware that he'd sent this telegram. And there is a sense in which Unity is actually acting as a broker between the significant power players in Nazi Germany and British Union of Fascists. And it's interesting that this is the exact point, the beginning of 1934, maybe in 1935, Mosley is actually going all in on anti-Semitism, you know, himself. Something they haven't really mentioned in 1932 when he set up the British Union of Fascists. So I then wondered whether his sister-in-law and presumably his wife, they're all in this atmosphere of increasing, you know, anti-Semitism. And I think Diana most definitely less so. Unity is going full in, and she writes a letter to Der Stürmer in which she says, "We urgently need a publication like Stürmer to tell people the truth. We will soon see that in England we too shall be victorious over the world enemy despite his cunning." And she continues, "We look forward to the day when England in its full power and might will be England for the English. Jews out. With German greetings, Heil Hitler. Unity Mitford. P.S. If you should happen to find room in your paper for this letter, please print my name in full. I do not want my name to appear initialed, for everyone should know I am a Jew hater." I mean, she's absolutely pinning her colors to the mast. And Streicher, when he prints this letter and he blazes it over his newspaper, he also makes sure to tell his readers that Unity is related to Winston Churchill. And this actually makes her incredibly newsworthy in Britain and Germany. And of course, it achieves exactly what Unity wants it to achieve. Namely, it gives her credibility with Hitler. I also get the impression that Unity was in a preferable position to a mistress. I'm not saying she wasn't, but maybe she wasn't at this stage. And she's not dependent on that mutual physical tie. She can actually sit and babble away to Hitler as a mistress never would have dared. And her intimacy with Hitler was odder than that. I think she was actually light relief, a combination of a younger sister, a court jester, and a talisman. And I think Hitler also enjoyed the fact that his henchmen didn't really want her there, but they couldn't say so. He was impressed by Britain. He was actually fascinated by its ability to command an empire. And like so many people, he was compelled by the British aristocracy. In his way, I think he was probably impressed by Unity herself. And I think, quite simply, Hitler felt happier with her around. And Laura Thompson, in her book, The 6 Lives of the Mitford Sisters, actually adheres to that, or, kind of points very much to that direction as well. So this is the real core of the story, isn't it? That this posh airhead, you might think has nothing to offer at all, actually becomes part of Hitler's inner circle. So Laura Thompson's book is brilliant. I absolutely loved it. It's all about the Mitford sisters, and she's much more generous towards Unity than David Price Jones is in his book. But interestingly, both of them are agreed that almost certainly there wasn't a sexual relationship in the early 1930s between Hitler and Unity. And I'm actually not sure that I agree. And I'll come to that a little later, because there is a story that Unity was carrying Hitler's love child. But for a second, let's act on the assumption that they weren't doing anything like this, that the relationship was platonic. And if that's the case, then what's going on? And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270, or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. I think Laura Thompson absolutely fixes on it, which is that Hitler is charmed by Unity. So Thompson talks about the Mitford sisters having this yearning towards lightness, which I think is an absolutely wonderful phrase. So even when you're going into the dark, they speak the language of the nursery. They talk with the utmost confidence, assuming that everyone will be interested in what they have to say. And to me, that means that Unity is actually very relaxed with Hitler in a way that no one else can be, because most people are either completely terrified of him or desperate for something. But Unity has already got what she wants. She wants to hang out with him. And so now she can just kind of prattle away using her kind of nursery language, which really kind of it's very disengaging. And she actually calls him Dear Sweet Hitler. I mean, goodness gracious. And she actually encourages Hitler to do impressions, and she gets him to tell jokes, and she gets him to do impressions, particularly of Mussolini, which apparently she found so funny. So it's evident that Hitler is able to kind of relax with her in a way that he can't with anyone else. And, in her words, to be a tremendous laugh. So all his impressions, all his gags, flowing out in a way that normally, with someone who is causing all this death and destruction in Europe, you just wouldn't think of. Definitely Unity amuses him, but I think there is also a sense that he feels that she has been sent to him by fate, because of the fact that her middle name is Valkyrie, and because she was actually born in swastika, and because her forebears are actually such significant figures in the history of anti-Semitism. I think Hitler feels, it's like, what are the odds that this gal would actually come from Britain with all these markers? And, Hitler's actually a very superstitious guy. He's a man of destiny. And I think there's a slight element of that as well. And so he gives her considerable amounts of favor, more so than he would anyone else. And he actually gives her a solid gold swastika badge with his signature engraved on the back, which is given to very, very few people. It's quite a special thing. It's like the golden ticket to the Charlie, the Charlie and the Wonka factory. You can go anywhere and do anything with this badge. And Unity actually uses this to her advantage quite a few times. So Unity actually introduces Diana to him, and you can imagine what a thrill that must have given the younger sister to introduce the glamorous elder sister to the Führer. And they're given splendid seats at the Olympic Games. In actual fact, if you Google old footage of the Olympic Games, 36 Olympic Games, you'll actually see the Mitford sisters there. You know, Hitler is sitting there rather naughtily, actually, next to Eva Braun, who's incredibly jealous, and in fact stages a suicide attempt to get his attention just after the games. And of course, Hitler does pay more attention to Eva Braun. And so that again kind of alerts Unity to the fact that melodrama and histrionics, this is actually how she's going to keep Hitler interested. This is what he desires. And I think also Unity is playing a kind of political role in a very gauche, clumsy way, because she's unbelievably indiscreet. So anything she's told, she will blab. And it's common knowledge. And Hitler also knows this. So he also knows then that he can actually use her basically to communicate with the upper classes in Britain. And there's actually an occasion where he lets slip purposely that he's very cross with Mussolini, and that they've had a bit of a falling out. And of course, Unity immediately reports that to all of her contacts back in London, and before you know it, the Foreign Office has heard about it, and of course number 10 Downing Street hears about it, and of course everyone's buzzing with possibilities for kind of peeling Hitler off Mussolini. And likewise, she's very indiscreet with what she hears in London. So she tells Hitler that according to Randolph Churchill, London has no air defenses. I mean, this is verging on the treasonous. If not, it is treason. And I think she doesn't think of it in those terms, but she's actually blabbing away. And I think what she is I think she's actually very patriotic and very proud to be British, but she also loves Germany as well. She loves her darling Führer. And I think she wants Britain and Germany to be in an alliance. And it may be at the margins of her thoughts, maybe she's thinking that she could perhaps play a role if her darling Führer would marry her. And, that would be an amazing domestic alliance. Imagine that, British aristocracy marrying to, Adolf Hitler. So as a schoolgirl, she actually told a friend of hers her ambition when she grew up was to become the power behind the mighty throne. So, perhaps there is a truthful element to my musings. And let's just put the British aristocracy into context just before the First World War. The British elite had actually been very, very pro-German. In fact, I'll do a podcast very soon about the First World War, where I'll actually allude to the fact that Britain nearly didn't enter the war, and almost, if they did enter the war, they almost entered on the side of the Germans. That's for a later podcast. During this time, the British aristocracy actually loved going to those terrible, German spas and doing all those kind of things German. And the upper classes in Britain actually loved German literature and German philosophy, the intelligent thinking people. And between the wars, there's lots of people. It's like the Lord Darlington novel, The Remains of the Day. People think, gosh, the First World War was such a tragedy, a friendship between Britain and Germany. They're so like us. They're so highbrow. The Germans have tremendous culture and all this sorts of stuff. So actually Unity, she's a very outlandish version of this, but I guarantee you there will be lots of aristocrats back in Britain and intelligent, well-educated people who would say, yes, Britain and Germany should have been friends, that they should be the two great pillars of the world order and all this kind of stuff, leading into the Second World War. And the Mitfords are all fascinated, by Germany, with the exception of Nancy, who's actually a tremendous Francophile. And she's got an amazing fascination with Paris. She goes to live in Paris. She has a famous romance with a colonel in the Free French. And she's making a statement there that she's not part of this obsession with Germany that is shaded into, kind of overt sympathy with fascism and Nazism. Because in the end, Diana isn't the only member of the family who Unity introduces to Hitler. And Nancy is making a statement by living in Paris. So Unity eventually gets her parents over, Lord Redesdale, who's famous for, thinking, once a Hun, always a Hun, don't mention the war, the First World War. He's immediately charmed by Hitler. And so is Lady Redesdale, who the first time she meets him, despite not speaking German, gives him a lecture on the best way to make bread. Incredible. And Lord Redesdale is completely won over by Hitler, and he goes back to the House of Lords and defends the Anschluss. And Lady Redesdale goes even further and actually starts writing articles in favor of Hitler and becomes very hostile to Churchill and actually calls him publicly that wicked man. Meanwhile, there is Diana. And Hitler is actually very taken with Diana. And he describes Unity and Diana in his diaries as the perfect examples of Aryan womanhood. Diana, of course, then smooths away for Mosley, and they both head over to Germany, and they actually get married in Goebbels' drawing room. How incredible. And even though Goebbels actually doesn't like them, but Hitler actually insists on it, and Hitler is actually at their wedding. Unity, interestingly, isn't invited because it's still a secret. The wedding still has to be kept a secret at this point, and they absolutely know that if Unity is invited, she'll blab to the entire world, so she's not there. Just to finish on the siblings, Tom, the only son, he actually meets Hitler as well, and he sympathizes, with Germany, and by extension, I guess, Nazism. He then joins the cause and goes on to fight the Japanese, where he dies in the war in Burma. Deborah, who is very apolitical, she also goes across and meets Hitler. In fact, the only members of the family who don't meet Hitler are Nancy and Jessica, the communist. And Violet Hammersley, who is a family friend of the Mitfords, said when she wrote to Nancy, "You Mitfords do love a dictator, don't you?" Which is obviously very true. Aristocratic people like the Mitfords, they would regard democracy and sort of non-violence and stuff. I think they would actually regard them as awful, vulgar, suburban, kind of middle-class values. Maybe. And maybe not. I mean, Deborah, or Debo, who goes on to marry the man in due course who becomes the Duke of Devonshire, I mean, she's kind of a classic conservative. But Diana, if I'm being honest, I think she would think of them as middle class and bourgeois and boring. And they would think of dictators as fun, really, wouldn't they? They love dressing up and pretending. I mean, I think it's a very early 1930s aristocratic view. And I actually think that's true. And I think hence the phrase frivolity of evil. But I think if you are tempted by that to think that there isn't really any harm being done, there are dimensions to Unity's behavior that I think is actually completely shocking. So there's some terrible stories which I think tell the real dark side of Unity, which means you can't get away with it just being frivolous. The frivolity of evil is actually, it was lurking there the whole time like a shadow following her around. And there's one story that she quite happily tells, that when she was in Germany, she'd met an old woman in town who was very obviously Jewish, loaded down with lots of bags. And the woman asks Unity the way to the railway station, and she responds, "I told her the wrong way to go because I saw how heavy the bundle was. Wasn't that wonderful of me?" I mean, what a monster. And there's another story, I think, which shows that shadow as well. There's a former friend of Unity's who went to art college with her, and she said that she boasted that it was such fun to have supper with Stryker, as you'd have the Jews in after the meal. They'd be brought up from the cellar where they were kept prisoner and then made to eat grass on the floor and then entertain the guests. I mean, this is terribly bad form. And there's nothing funny about anything that she's doing, which is why I think we have to call it a court for this. And she becomes increasingly notorious in England. And there's a famous ditty which is published in one of the papers about her that says, "You can't criticize Unity with impunity. If you try to belittle her, you'll have to answer to Hitler." She then gets caught up in a riot in Hyde Park where she's wearing her uniform. I think it's Attlee, who later becomes prime minister, who is actually speaking. And she's goose stepping around in the background, giving the Hitler salute in her black uniform. And, she has to be bundled into a cab before she's set upon by the crowd. And like her mother, she is busy, writing articles in favor of Hitler in the British press. And she stays committed to Hitler, even as it becomes increasingly evident that Britain is going to be going to war with Germany. So in 1939, she goes to Bayreuth, to the festival there with Diana. And Hitler basically says to them, look, you two need to get out of Germany because we're going to be going to war. And Diana duly goes back home. But this is interesting. Unity stays there. And maybe one of the reasons why she stays there, and it's a very physical evidence both of his favor and of her desire to become German, is that Hitler has actually given her a flat. So he's actually given her a choice of 4 flats in Munich. And she's gone round, and again, a terrible story. She goes around, she chooses one that she wants, and she walks around the house saying things like, these curtains won't do, we must get rid of this awful sofa, get rid of the carpets. Meanwhile, the 2 people who are being dispossessed, which are an older Jewish couple, are actually sitting in the hallway, sobbing away, and she pays no attention to them whatsoever. And of course, this is the background to the most famous incident in her life, which is when war is declared. Britain declares war on Germany. She's in Munich at the time. She's in her apartment, but where she's living, and this is the apartment that's been taken from the Jewish couple, is very near the English Garden in Munich. And she has a very small caliber pearl-handled pistol, which she's been given by Hitler, and she decides that she's going to take herself to the park. And it's here where she shoots herself in the head. But it doesn't kill her. She's found, she's bundled into an ambulance, she's recognized, Hitler is informed, he immediately sends flowers, Goebbels and Ribbentrop, they also send flowers. And on the 10th of September, so within the opening weeks, Hitler visits her. I mean, imagine that. Imagine having the time to go and do this, which tells me that there was something very different, very special about their relationship, which is why I tend to disagree with her other 2 biographers who say that there was nothing actually happening between the 2. And she doesn't recognize him because she's mentally shot. And as she comes to, she tries to commit suicide a second time by swallowing her swastika badge, the gold swastika badge that Hitler's given her. But that doesn't work. And it's only after 6 weeks that she's actually able to speak again. And on the 8th of November, Hitler comes again. And of course, this is the last time that they will meet. And Hitler actually says to her, what do you want to do? Do you want to stay here or do you want to be sent back to England? And she actually says that she wants to go back to England. And so Hitler arranges for her to be taken to Bern in neutral Switzerland. He sends her there by rail, where she's met by her mother and her younger sister, Deborah. It must have been hideous for her to be jolted along. The bullet's still in her head. They hadn't managed to remove it. And what's interesting is that when she arrives in Folkestone, there's a kind of tremendous scandal because there's armed guards everywhere, when the train arrives. And this will actually become the subject of much public criticism. It's actually uncertain with regards to whether the armed guards are actually there to stop people from looking at her or whether they're just there coincidentally. But there is a feeling in the press that she's actually getting special treatment that would not be afforded to other people to protect her from the crowds. And in the Commons, Herbert Morrison, who will, of course, go on to become Home Secretary in the coalition government, he describes her as a British subject that has been openly assisting the cause of an enemy government and asks, would a working class person receive similar treatment? And of course they wouldn't. He's absolutely right to raise the question. And of course, the Prime Minister just shuts him down. If you think about that in today's context and the cases of British citizens, British subjects recently, actually, like Shamana Begum, who has been, she was actually working with the Islamic State. I think Unity Mitford should have been dropped into the channel from a very great height, personally. But they eventually take her to Radcliffe in Oxford, and they say that there's no chance of extracting the bullet from her brain. And she's actually left with the mental age of a 10-year-old, and she's also left permanently incontinent. Just to finish on her suicide attempt, this is actually on the day that Britain declared war on Germany. And it's not just because that her two beloved countries are going to war with each other. I don't think. I think it's also that she's actually finally been proven so comprehensively wrong about so many things, and effectively that all her silly daydreams are actually fantasies. But I guess the question I have is there any sense of guilt there before she does it? Basically, to cut a long story short, she never really recovers, and in due course, she gets meningitis, and she dies at the age of 33. So I think in 1948, so just after the war. She's never in prison, so unlike her sister Diana, who actually gets locked up in Holloway, she's never actually imprisoned. On her parents, well, her parents split up in the war because the moment Britain declares war on Germany, Lord Redesdale, an absolute patriot, swings behind the British war effort and goes back to thinking that the Huns are beastly and once a Hun, always a Hun. Lady Redesdale doesn't. She actually remains an enthusiast for Hitler, a supporter of Hitler. And, because of the succession of tragedies, they split up. Jessica, the communist sister, she moves to America and doesn't come back. Tom dies in Burma. And of course, then you have the death of unity in 1948. So there's a lot going on with this family. The big question, of course, is she carrying Hitler's child when she shot herself? And this theory actually was prompted by the release of classified documents in 2002, which actually quoted an MI5 officer by the name of Guy Liddell, who said, "We have no evidence to support press allegations that she was in a serious state of health." Okay, so did she shoot herself? But she was brought in on a stretcher to avoid publicity and unpleasantness for her family. So that led to the theory that she never actually shot herself. He actually says, "We have no evidence to support press allegations that she was in a serious state of health." So that being the case, if she hadn't shot herself, why did Hitler let her leave? And so the theory then came about that she was actually burying his child, and this is why she came back. Interestingly, Martin Bright, who was the political editor of the New Statesman at the time, he actually received a phone call from a woman who claimed that Unity Mitford had gone to a private maternity hospital in Oxford. And so putting all these clues together, 2 + 2 = 9, it's assumed that there was a child, Hitler's love child, and that the child was actually taken away and brought up by who knows. And with that, the Hitler dynasty may well have survived, and there's someone roaming the Kent countryside as we speak with Hitler's genes. And I have to say, if you've met some of the people from the Kent countryside, you might not be surprised. I mean, in fairness to that story, no Hitler biographer or Mitford biographer has ever given actually any kind of theory or credence to this whatsoever. But that doesn't mean that it's not true. The fact that there are Mitford scholars and the fact that, they are still subjects of fascination, I think it's fascinating. I think it's interesting. There's a long-standing idea that the Mitford sisters were all about, kind of frothy silliness. And in lots of ways, that's why the Brits still like them. But if the pursuit of love, with its shockingly, kind of unchicklit ending, reminds us of anything, it's that sense that 6 women weathered moments of extraordinary darkness in their lives. Nancy had numerous miscarriages and a miserable marriage and suffered a cruelly painful cancer. Jessica's first husband was killed in the war and she lost 2 of her children. Debo lost 4 children shortly after, giving birth to them. In a life where having each other meant so much, Diana, I guess in later life, also had to bear the pain of losing each of her sisters and finally being the last one standing. I remember watching an interview with Barry Gibb, the Bee Gees brother to Robin and Maurice Gibb, and I think he's the older of the brothers, and he actually said, "I never thought that I would be the last brother standing, that I would see my 2 other brothers die before me." And I think Diana had the same feeling, that she probably never thought that she would be the last Mitford standing. That being said, Diana actually lived a long life, and she appeared, I remember seeing her on a chat show in the early 80s, and I'll read what she said when asked about the Holocaust and whether she believed in the 6 million figure. And I think the show was actually Desert Island Discs, that amazing BBC, kind of show. And her response was, "I don't really. I'm afraid I don't believe that 6 million people were killed. I think this is just not conceivable. It's too many. But, whether it's 6 or whether it's 1, it makes no difference morally. It's completely wrong. I think it was a dreadful, wicked thing." So that's actually kind of mind-blowing. I mean, sure, she's acknowledging that Hitler did wicked things, but she's also engaging in Holocaust denial on the BBC's premier radio interview show, in the 1980s. And, thinking about it, I don't think either Mosley or Diana ever seemed to have been crippled by guilt or had any sense of guilt or regret any of the things that they said or they did. And I think with Diana, it's precisely because she absolutely holds to her devotion to Mosley. And also because they both have this sort of, aristocratic, this bumptious, kind of self-confidence. It would be so suburban to say, oh, I feel sorry, I made mistakes, and all these kind of things. They just wouldn't do it. They have this kind of invincible assurance, self-assurance. Interestingly, just with Mosley, just because I guess listeners will be wondering what happened to Mosley, just to wrap up his story, he was actually imprisoned during the Second World War when the Second World War started, and he was actually released on medical grounds in November 1943. And the rest of his story, the rest of his life, it's all of an irrelevance, really. He's released, he's a very toxic figure. He set up something called the Union Movement, arguingly that as bizarrely as it may sound, he actually argued for European unity, but in a sort of, Christian unity against Bolshevism and that kind of thing. But he was never taken that seriously. It's kind of looking at a European Union as a disguised fascist bulwark, against communism. So it never really took off. And of course, then he moved into anti-immigration. So that's not so anti-Semitic, but he was more racist against people who moved to Britain from South Asia and also the Caribbean in the 1960s. And he actually stands for election again in North Kensington in 1959 and receives only 8% of the vote. And of course, this is an area where there were massive race riots. So you think they would have voted him in. They didn't. So he actually does this very badly. That's actually in Notting Hill. So he does this very badly, which is a sign of, I think, how toxic his reputation has become. By this stage, the British Union of Fascists has actually broken up. It goes into, eventually, I think, into other far-right movements. There's the British National Party, or the BNP, and of course the National Front in the 1970s, 1980s. And I remember those guys very, very well. Ultimately, these are quite small organizations that never really remotely had a chance of winning a single parliamentary seat. And meanwhile, he actually goes to live in Paris, a bit like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. I certainly remember Mosley growing up. I remember his name, and he was always associated with the symbol of far-right racism. But he was also, as I've said, in later life, a ludicrous figure because he had become such a failure. But I think the thing that we forget is that in the 1920s and 1930s, he was such a strong, charismatic figure that smart people, thought he actually one day might be prime minister, that he was actually a serious and imaginative political thinker. And of course, then he made those stupid gambles, leaving the Labour Party, setting up the new party, setting up the BUF that actually led nowhere, because fascism, I think, in Britain had no space to expand into either their parliamentary system because it was too resilient. Britain had won the First World War. So actually it ends up being associated with, eccentric people like the Mitfords and never really wins over Middle England. And unity, well, I mean, she strikes me, well, let's just finish by saying that the people who run the Mitford heritage industry shouldn't be ringing to thank me. I think the Mitford Sisters' legacy is all down to Nancy, and I think she was a very good novelist and a very good writer. And I think the view that we have of the Mitford Sisters now is a testament to the power of her fiction, that she cast this kind of amazing golden luster over all of the other more monstrous sisters. That being said, she was an absolute towering snob. So not a friend of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, I think. Thanks for listening in, folks. It's much appreciated as always, and I look forward to chatting to you next week. Bye for now.